Football managers are supposed to be the leader of their club. They might not be the owner, but the players, the coaches, the fans, they should all hang on their every word. But why does it seem like nowadays a lot of managers have lost their authority in the dressing room? So in this video, we're going to ask the question, have managers lost all their power? I'll be honest, there's two main reasons why I'm making this video. One is Jim Ratcliffe, Ineos, and basically the way they want to run Manchester United. And two is Brian Clough. I ended up watching The Damn United the other day, and one, brilliant film, but two, it took me down a rabbit hole of old Brian Clough interviews, and it just showed how managers have just changed throughout history. Of course, you can't compare a manager who's in the 70s and 80s and early 90s compared to the modern manager. There's the infamous interview of Don Revie, the legendary Leeds United coach, and Brian Clough just after he got sacked from Leeds. And it just showed how in charge those two men were of their respective football clubs. Clough had a well-documented power struggle with the Derby chairman at the time in the early 70s, Sam Longston. But from what I can read and what I can go back and watch, it seemed like Brian Clough was in charge of the coaching, and then his mate Peter Taylor was in charge of the recruitment, and that was a match made in heaven. I'm not trying to say a 2, 3, 4-man band can run a football team anymore, because that's simply, they can't, can they? Most teams have 20, 30 deep analytical teams, scouting teams, training teams, therapists, personal chefs, even probably barbers and on-call tattoo artists. But something that I can't wrap my head around is the board of football teams deciding on the way they should play football. And this is where it links it back to Ineos and Jim Ratcliffe. Could you imagine in 2003 when the Glazers came in, telling Alex Ferguson, who's been so successful over the previous 10 years, how to play football? And I'll completely concede that Ineos, Jim Ratcliffe and a lot of them have identified, some issues with Manchester United. They've seen the recruitment just is not good enough, and they've seen the culture around the club is not good enough. Fair play to them, but when I'm reading articles about Ruben Amorim when he came into Man United a few months ago, and it's saying Jim Ratcliffe and the sporting directors and everyone involved, they want a say in the footballing decisions that go onto the pitch, the world must have gone mad. Because how can Jim Ratcliffe, a man who has had no real prior footballing experience until 2017, tell someone like Ruben Amorim or even Erik ten Hag at the time, who have lived football throughout their entire careers, how to play? As much as FSG clearly brought in an analytical approach to Liverpool, I don't believe, from whatever I can read, John W. Henry ever told Jurgen Klopp to stop gegenpressing and do a bit of tiki-taka. And I get it, because as everyone constantly says, there's no money in football. So when these owners are coming into the football club, what are they doing it for? Essentially, they're doing it to have a bit of an asset to show off to the rich maids, and they're probably making the club viable to sell within the next 10 to 15 years. So naturally, I can kind of understand them wanting to influence footballing decisions. However, as we all know, there can be too many cooks sometimes, and it can lead to disasters. I think a great example is Thomas Tuchel when he was at Chelsea. He's one of Chelsea's most successful managers. He was brilliant at his time there. It didn't end in a great way, but he brought Chelsea their second Champions League in the club history. And once everything with Ukraine happened, where Abramovich's assets got frozen and he essentially got ousted out of the club, when Todd Bowley and Clearlake came in, it seemed like they wanted an influence in footballing decisions. What happened to a rich owner just hiring people who know so much more than them, instead of them literally being in charge of transfers, coaching decisions, and so on and so on? I mean, I know we all heard the stories of Todd Bowley saying, let's play a 4-4-3 formation, or seriously trying to sign Cristiano Ronaldo at the time. But in a serious sense, I believe part of the reason why Thomas Tuchel actually left and became really disgruntled, because one, he had to do a lot of the sport and directing roles, but two, apparently he was left out completely of transfer decisions. When they signed Zakaria from Juventus at the time, apparently he was just not in the know at all. I don't think it's uncommon for a manager not to get every player they want, because famously with Jurgen Klopp, he wanted to sign Julian Brandt from Borussia Dortmund, and Michael Edwards, the sporting director at the time, signed Mohamed Salah. And to be honest, in Jurgen Klopp's last season at Liverpool, from what I read, he got a lot of the recruitment responsibility because Michael Edwards had left and they couldn't find a reliable sporting director. And you could argue after Edwards left, he didn't sign the Mo Salahs, the Andy Robertsons, the Sadio Manes. He was signing people like Darwin Núñez for 65 million, Dominic Szoboszlai for 60 million. Again, look at Erik ten Hag. He apparently had a massive same recruitment at Man United. And again, you could argue they haven't made a 8 out of 10 and above signing during his time there. So I do completely concede that a manager should not have final say on everything. There's a reason why they're a manager and they're not a scout. Like I said with Brian Clough, he delegated to Peter Taylor so much because he didn't have an eye for talent, but Peter Taylor did. But in Thomas Tuchel's sense, to not be involved at all. It just must be insulting, and I can see why he left. A person who put this into words well was David Moyes, because after he got sacked from West Ham, he discussed that he wanted to say over transfers on the Stick to Football podcast. He was actually quoted saying, "When you think back over time, as football managers, we never really wanted to bring in 8 players. You didn't want your squad changing so much. Bigger squads mean more players not playing, so it means more players unhappy." It must be very frustrating to be someone like a David Moyes, who's lived in the era of the late 90s, the 2000s, where he was the patriarch of Everton, wasn't he? Despite Bill Kenwright being massively popular and influential, it felt like everything went through David Moyes. But naturally, as you go over time and the scouting teams get bigger, the analytical teams get bigger, and everyone in between, they were getting pushed out more and more and more. But can it not just be the owners, the chairman, the directors, that are seemingly taking away power from the managers a bit? Could it be the players and the agents? Again, as we talk about the 2000s, maybe the golden era of Premier League managers, Jose Mourinho, Arsene Wenger, Rafa Benitez, Sir Alex Ferguson, but at least at that time it felt like managers were on a level playing field with footballers. Football has always been a star league, hasn't it? David Beckham in the 90s was massive. He got bigger than Man United at one point, but there was always that overlaying part of Alex Ferguson. John Terry, Frank Lampard, Chelsea were becoming an international success, but Jose Mourinho was at the helm. However, nowadays, I think it's lesser, because in those days as well, you could see it with Bolton. Sam Allardyce was at the helm of that. Everton with David Moyes. But as the Premier League has grown, and obviously the footballers are what make football brilliant, star power is just increasing and increasing. So in a good way and a bad way, footballers have more of a say on the decisions of their career. In 2022, it was reported that the average manager in the Premier League had a lifespan of 2 years and 4 days. If you went 10 years prior to that in 2012, it was just under 4 years. And clearly that will also be part of just wanting to win now, stay up, because there's so much money in the Premier League. But it's also because players are much harder to get rid of. For example, it was reported by The Guardian that sacking Ten Hag and bringing in Ruben Amorim cost Man United about £21.4 million. This, in relative terms to football, is not a huge amount to Man United. Whereas you compare that to the issue they're facing at the moment with Marcus Rashford, something they'd never do, but if they did, if they released him on his £325k a week contract, let's say there's 3 years left of that, you're looking at 16.9 million per season, and in 3 years that is worth over £50 million, and that is probably the minimum without bonuses and everything else. But also to replace him, you will have to spend another 50 million minimum, so it's going to cost over 100 million to get rid of a player like a Marcus Rashford. So naturally the clubs will want to keep the players happy or keep them on the books long enough. Maybe Rashford isn't the best example of that, but you understand what I mean. Plus, with the new clauses in contracts nowadays, it seems like a lot of the top players have release clauses going to a new club. The late Mino Raiola, the super agent, he always seemed to put release clauses in his players' contracts because it allowed for flexibility. They never were stuck in a place too long if they reached the heights that everyone thought they would. Look at Erling Haaland. Erling Haaland went to Man City for just over 50 million. And that wasn't Man City's brilliant negotiating skills. That was because he had a release clause coming from Borussia Dortmund. And he had a release clause going to Borussia Dortmund from Salzburg. So this will always give a player the upper hand on the manager, but also the club, because they can always try to renegotiate the contract. I mean, look at Haaland. He's just signed a 10-year deal with Man City. I'm sure they're buzzing, but another reason, I'm sure they don't have a release clause in his contract, or if it is, it'll be like 500-600 million. But the big one, which I think it didn't eliminate power for managers, because as I've said, Jurgen Klopp had all the power in the world. Pep Guardiola is clearly in charge of Manchester City. But the move was in 2017 when Neymar went to PSG for over 200 million. But just think about it, Unai Emery was the manager at PSG when Neymar came in. He had a poor career at Arsenal. He had done well in the Europa League previously, but he wasn't a household name. So therefore you had maybe the third best player in the world coming to your club for that amount of money. There's no way he could drop him. There's no way if he's late he could berate him, he could fine him. So it must have been so frustrating at the time. Essentially your hands are tied by the board because they've spent this amount of money on this superstar player. They need him to do well because it's a financial investment. But then you had Kylian Mbappé, which didn't only remove some of the manager's power, it completely wiped it out. The lad's had a contract for 50 million euros per season. But it wasn't because of the salary why he removed some of the power, it was because the board at PSG allowed him to make some footballing decisions. That I remember that day because no one could believe it. No one could believe a lad in his early 20s at the time could be making footballing decisions. And as we saw, that was a terrible mistake, as was everything at PSG, because they didn't win the Champions League in the end. And if you think about it, the only time they nearly won the Champions League was when they had a strong character in the manager position. And who was that? It was Thomas Tuchel. Could you imagine in the 70s if Trevor Francis was telling Brian Clough how to manage his European Cup winning side? But I think PSG are a brilliant case study of essentially the players taking over the club and the manager just being a figurehead. Mauricio Pochettino, Luis Enrique, they got these great managers in, but it didn't mean anything because Lionel Messi, Neymar and Mbappé were starting up front and there was no wavering between that. And like I say, I think that was one of PSG's huge downfalls. But again, as I say in nearly every video, it's just how football is changing. Not every club is like this, and I think we can see with Pep Guardiola at Man City, he's clearly brilliant. I'm sure he has a massive team around him that help him, but you never hear stories of Sheikh Mansour telling Pep Guardiola to play Rico Lewis instead of Kyle Walker. Maybe Man United would be successful instilling a culture through Ineos and Jim Ratcliffe and all of them, because clearly there's been a toxic culture throughout the club since Ferguson. But naturally, I think there's a reason why managers can't seem to get it right at Man United, and it always feels there's influence coming from upstairs. It shouldn't be a 2-3-man band anymore like it was in the 60s, the 70s. Managers need help. They need someone to defer their recruitment policy to. They need someone to bounce tactics off. But when you are hearing about managers who essentially just have to G the players up before the game, it sounds a bit silly sometimes. But let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about managers nowadays. Do they have any power? Do they have too much power potentially in some clubs? Is it just the times are changing and naturally a football club organisation are going to bring in more and more workers to help the club win? But yeah, leave a comment below if you could leave a like, and if you subscribe to the channel, it would be brilliant. But thanks for watching.